I did stumble across a company that you can contract with to design your company town, even today. You can reach
What?
out to them and ask, yeah, because there's still a lot of mineral extraction going on in Africa, whether it's diamonds or whether it's other valuable resources like that. They're still building these kinds of towns. And this is people buying up farmland to be able to extract it. And so you can reach out to these guys and they'll help design a town that keeps people in one place, limits their information, gives them everything they need, and serves your company ledger.
This is a service that's available.
Yep.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one.
This episode is brought to you by Stars. Lisa Tadeo's best-selling book is about to become your favorite new show. Based on a true story, the new Stars original series 3 Women stars Shailene Woodley as Gia, a grieving and struggling writer who embarks on a cross-country road trip where she meets 3 women determined to radically change their lives. This one is not to be missed. Watch the season premiere of 3 Women now, only on Stars and the Stars app.
Corporate colonialism is defined as the policy or practice of a wealthy or powerful nation's maintaining or extending its control over other countries, especially in establishing settlements or exploiting resources. Avatar and Dune, anyone? Writer Lindsay DeFrates joins the podcast today to talk about what drives corporate colonialism, how it impacts the native populations, and how fiction can be an effective tool for change. Lindsay DeFrates, thank you so much for joining Speculative Sandbox today. I'm really excited to talk about corporate colonialism. First, tell me and our listeners about yourself and some of your latest projects.
Well, thanks for having me on, Vicky. I am very excited to be here. I am living in Glenwood Springs, which is on the western slope of Colorado in the mountains. We have lots of snow outside today, but we also have a blue sky, which is nice. I work in PR and media, so a lot of what I do involves words all day long. And I also have 3 kids at home. So when I'm writing, it is usually early in the morning at the 5 a.m. Writers Club or late in the evening after all the bedtimes, if I can wring any more drops of creativity out of it. I'm currently editing a science fiction novel, a space western, and trying to get to the end of that. And I've pitched and queried a few places, kind of just learning the ropes of those steps right now, though.
Wow. So I didn't know that about your I guess your day gig or your daylighting. I also work in PR, communications and media. So
Excellent.
it goes hand in hand with writing stories because it's a large part of the job is to create and stories for media relations. I'm guessing that's what you do.
Yeah, I work for a small government agency that advocates for the Colorado River water on the western slope of Colorado, actually. So we're not as much marketing. I do a lot of, media relations in journalists, and I do the social and all the newsletters, stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of overlap.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so cool. So yeah, you similar backgrounds. That's so much fun.
Excellent.
All right. So I have some rapid fire warm-up questions for you just to get us started. You ready?
Oh, let me listen up. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, these are easy. They just kind of get us in the right mindset. So the first one is if you could have an unlimited supply of one thing, what would it be?
You mean like food or water kind of thing, or
I guess to make it more fun outside of the essential like food and water supply, shelter, if aside from that.
Okay, unlimited supply. Fresh tomatoes
Oh,
all
fresh
year round.
tomatoes. Yum.
Perfect, not greenhouse, hothouse tomatoes.
Gotcha. I used to grow tomatoes when I lived in California. We'd have them growing around the side of the house, and my mom would pick them right off the stem and eat them like an apple. They were really good when you grow them like that.
Yep.
What TV show are you currently into?
Um, So my husband and I used to watch really thoughtful TV and sometimes intense, scary TV, but now we have 3 children. So anything that involves emotional endurance is off the table.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go with the easy ones. I'm really into the Detectorists right now.
Oh, where do you get that? Where do you stream it?
It's on Amazon. It's a little British show that just has to do with a bunch of British folk using metal detectors to find what they can about history and learning and growing
Oh, I
through
love
life
that.
together. It's quite delightful.
That's awesome. Okay. What's a chore that you hate doing?
Folding 43 pieces of tiny children's clothes just to know that they will be unfolded 30 minutes later.
Okay. And now these questions are going to segue into our topic a little bit. Which corporation do you think is doing the most harm?
In the world?
Yes.
Oh man, I would have to say it's probably any corporation involved in the palm oil industry right now.
Okay. What is palm oil?
Oh, it's used, gosh, let me see if I can make sure I didn't have this part pulled up. It's used in so many products of our food, and we rely on it. It's edible vegetable oil, and it's obviously used a lot in food processing and manufacturing. We have it in beauty products as well as biofuel, and there's ways to source it responsibly, but there are some very, very egregious corporations involved in it right now.
Okay. My next question might seem kind of strange, but to look at the positives, like the inverse of my last question is, which corporation do you think is doing the most good?
Corporations doing the most good. That's really hard to say. I've become very wary of any corporation that spans states and nationalities. When I find anything doing the most good, it's usually at the local level, the community level. So I really can't answer that. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure there are some though that are.
Okay. Well, there goes our topic, right? Our topic is corporate colonialism. And so when I think of corporate colonialism and in the speculative fiction realm, the first thing I think of is Avatar, where they
Yep.
go mining on a different planet
Uh-huh.
and using those resources and affecting the native tribes. So yeah, talk to me about colonialism and then corporate colonialism.
Sure. So sometimes people today think of corporate colonialism as neo-colonialism. And right now, I just have to stop and acknowledge that it has an outsized impact on indigenous populations. And so as I speak from my privilege as a white person here in Colorado, I have to recognize that I am on the lands of the Ute Indians and the Shoshone tribes as well. Whenever we're talking about corporate colonialism, it's the idea that businesses built on extracting natural resources for profit can use their might and their means to take over land that isn't theirs, whether it's occupied or foreign, and they exploit usually economic weaknesses in the system or unstable governments to make sure that they can turn a profit at any cost, most costs, as long as it looks good on their actual ledger.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times they have investors that take land from indigenous people without prior knowledge or consent, and eventually leads to those people's removal. So whenever we're talking about corporate colonialism, we definitely have to go back around to acknowledge who it is impacting the most.
Yes. And comparing it to just regular colonialism, is it a government versus corporation difference? What separates those two definitions?
That's a great question. In working definitions, now this is not 100% across the board fixed definition. There's a lot of takes on corporate colonialism, but the largest difference is that it doesn't involve armies, weapons, or even often threats of violence to reap the benefits of colonial power. So you get all of the goods without having to maintain a system of like military strength. Most of the time, it is through financial contributions to political allies, promises that everyone's going to get rich if corporations are allowed to do what they do, and that it's going to be beneficial for everyone involved.
Okay. So then when we think of corporate colonialism, can it when I think of colonialism, I think of, Britain coming over, colonizing, French colonies throughout Vietnam. Like it seems like a very defined government moving over, invading. would you say that corporate colonialism can be a more just as damaging, but more like a subtle kind of melting in and taking over?
It can be subtle and it can also not be subtle. I think
Okay.
that the damages can be harder to track because they do not involve moving political boundaries. You're not
Mm-hmm.
seeing states and countries change shape. It usually happens within the governments or within the spaces of those countries. So the damages of it and the impact of it is often more insidious than the traditional in colonialism, where you see pieces moving across the map or you see colonies being staked, flags flying. It doesn't look like that. The damages can be more difficult to address because of that, because we well, in our worship of capitalism are willing to blame anyone who signed a contract rather
Mm-hmm.
than the people who first wrote that contract, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yes, that's a really, really good perspective. So, what makes you interested in this topic? What is your relationship to corporate colonialism?
So, I mean, it's around all over the world today. Personally, I live again in the mountains of Colorado, and our history is with natural resource extraction as far back as whether people were looking for pelts and furs from the creatures, and then the mining that was looking for silver, gold, more recently uranium, even more recently than that, natural gas, oil. All of those industries have a very target on these mountains because they are so full of these mineral resources. So throughout the last 200 years in the places where I've lived, we've had towns that have boom and busted over silver, over gold, over oil. And we're still seeing constant headlines in our local paper about a strip mine that I can almost see from my window here. So the idea of companies taking advantage of resources without regards to their impact on residents is something that I see every day.
Mm. Why do you think fiction is such a great tool for exploring corporate colonialism?
Because you get to mix truth with escapism.
Hmm.
A lot of people are tired of reading the headlines. They will listen to a story though, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you ever feel that uh I guess by reading the story you can affect change, or do you think there's still a degree of distance or people, oh, it's just a story, and they have a hard time connecting between the fiction world and the real world?
I think stories build a framework for action. I don't
Okay.
think stories work with like a heavy-handed call to action. If you've ever read Edward Abbey, you can make yourself the judge of that. People who have really heavy-handed messaging in stories often turn off a lot of audiences. However, when there's truth in a story, we are wired as humans to connect with that much more deeply and much more quickly than any amount of facts and name calling that we could possibly pile into, say, a journalism article. If you want an example, I don't want to, never mind, I don't want to get too political. There's a lot of examples of people who will take an anecdote from a friend over piles of, say, medical research, and it feels truer because
Mhm.
someone told you a story about what happened to them than the cold numbers on the page.
Oh, interesting. Yes. Okay. So let's talk about corporate colonialism in fiction. The one example I mentioned before earlier, Avatar, seems to be the most prevalent, especially with the sequel that just hit theaters. Another book that when I was researching on corporate colonialism, is called The Terraformers by Annalee Newitz.
Mhm.
That one, have you read that one, or are you aware of that one?
It is on the top of my to be read list, which
Okay.
then neglected for a month or two.
That's perfectly fine because I haven't actually read it. I just saw it on the list and it looked like it was corporate colonialism is a big part of this one. So now I am adding it to my to be read list, and I'll read like a quick synopsis. But Destri's life is dedicated to terraforming Sask E, so it's a planet. And as
Mhm.
part of the environmental rescue team, she cares for the planet and its burgeoning ecosystems as her parents and their parents did before her. But the bright, clean future they're building comes under threat when she discovers a city full of people that shouldn't exist, hidden inside a massive volcano. So it's
Mhm.
interesting because she's there. She's like an external force that's come there to oversee this planet, but now it seems as if they found the native population. That's
Mm.
just assumptions on my part, but it must be a really interesting look at corporate colonialism in a sci-fi space opera type perspective.
Yes, it does sound amazing. A couple others. So in the recent publishing, Persephone Station is another great one.
Okay.
Stina Licht, I'm afraid I'm saying her name wrong. It was recently published, and she has just an absolutely fascinating look at the interactions of very heavy-handed corporation. Theirs does involve a significant amount of military strength, and her characters are just dynamic and original, and I'd highly recommend it. It's very exciting.
Do you think it's easier to, because I feel like when it comes to real world applications of colonialism, there seems like so many sensitivities, but with fiction, you can kind of have like a bigger grasp on the issue. Do you think that it's like that's why fiction is also so beneficial? You can kind of wrap it all into what the problem is more clearly than maybe you could addressing headlines in the real life.
Absolutely. It's very easy to distract people from the root cause in the news cycle. You can have all kinds of drama and red herrings off to the side. As a PR and media specialist, I'm particularly sensitive when you start seeing the headlines shift to focus on what this person said about what the other person said, but they're both important. And so we're reading that now and not about the issue itself.
That's so frustrating.
It happens frequently.
Yes, it does. Anyway, I'm sorry, you had some other examples?
No, I was just going to say, if we're going classic examples, we do have to nod to Dune, of course.
Yes,
That's
yes.
one of the biggest ones. And I think that one does, I think in its time, did a very good job of capturing the impact of that kind of overreach on Indigenous populations and looking at how a resource can become it's as though everyone in the galaxy thinks they own it because it was discovered and because they now use it all the time. And so how that shifts the value of the planet or the people on it sort of irrevocably once everyone believes that they are entitled to it.
Let's talk about that entitlement. That
Hmm.
because that must be the root behind a lot of the actions of corporate colonialism. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I think at its root, it is probably closer to intentional exploitation, where vulnerable establishments have valuable resources. And I think one of your questions, maybe I'm jumping ahead later, just talking about villains though, because I often equate the two. Um, the people who become the villains in a world run by corporate colonialism are those who believe, either consciously or just through hubris, or even unconsciously through an ingrained survival instinct. Perhaps they themselves never had the resources they need. That might is going to make right. And so sometimes it's tied to power, but at its root is always going to be security. The people who just always feel like they're going to need more. And there's definitely those who just want more, but I think more often than not, that entitlement goes along with a sense of, I don't have enough. I have to keep shoring up my power. I have to have more saved. I have to have a better position, a stronger perspective. We look at corporate colonialism as the evil, but I don't always know that it starts that way.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, I think of many of the rhetoric that we hear now, why things go overseas is to benefit us and our people and
Mm-hmm.
our accessibility to goods. And meanwhile, like for example, um, the diamond industry, we all go, oh, this is so beautiful. So then you find out like all the bloody terrible things that are happening in the communities where they're extracting these diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of some other example, like sweatshops. We all benefit, like we know that Shein is a sweatshop store
Mm-hmm.
and they rip off designers, and people don't care because they can pay $5 for a fashionable shirt. And so
Right.
then the damage just keeps going.
Yeah, and I think you're right that that does tie back to entitlement. We now are trained to believe that we need all of these things, and could we do it less? That's
Hmm.
always the question. Another modern example I just wanted to throw out too is kind of a brutal one, but in Liberia after 2014, they'd had civil war and then an Ebola outbreak, and corporations interested in rubber, logging, and palm oil swept in and bought up just millions of hectares of of farmland, forests, peatlands, and they turned it into monocropped plantations
Oh
for
wow.
soy, oil palm, and other cash crops.
Hmm.
And so it's again that we're rescuing these people from their poverty, from their insecurity, their inability to save themselves, and then they're spending $100 to buy what would be an endlessly renewable resource in its natural environment.
Yeah, I was looking into that case too, and
Mm-hmm.
how like there's a lot of promises, For instance, subsistence farmers are promised great financial rewards to convert their crops accordingly, while being assured that they'll see community benefits in the forms of schools and clinics. But then they were forced to clear that land,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the promised infrastructure never came. So it's scary to and it's funny because I feel like this is something that's also kind of explored when you look at, any kind of movie like Avatar or Pocahontas,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, what do these settlers want, and will we get something out of it? And you want to have good faith and think that these people trust in you, but then the outcome results in lots of death and exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, has there ever been a case like, what would you call a case where that doesn't happen, where newcomers come in and it's like a beautiful merging of worlds?
Huh. Um, That's a really hard one. It's interesting that you ask for that because I've seen those sort of requests appear on agent manuscript wish lists recently, where it's
Ooh.
either the uncolonized world, of course, or the one where there were positive solutions for all involved. And I have been frustrated because it's hard for me to imagine those. I'm so steeped in this culture that we've built around exploitation of resources, and if we can go and lay a claim on it, if we can draw our lines on the map, it's ours.
Yeah,
It's so hard to imagine what would it look like to share that space.
that is it. I didn't realize that that was something that was showing up on wish lists. My mother grew up in the French colonies of Vietnam, and
Mm,
what's really interesting is like I see like the long-term impacts. I've been reading up on the states of a lot of the, like, she was orphaned in her youth, and so she was in like one of those religious homeschooling boarding school situations, and she would tell me stories, and then I went back and started reading stories
mm,
on the conditions of these schools, and they're terrible. Like, I understand why my mom struggles with the things that she struggles with now, but she came over to America, and a lot of people just see her as Vietnamese, but even
mhm,
she has a split personality because she grew up in the French colonies. So Vietnam was her second language. She understands westernized French culture. The Vietnamese culture was street learned, and she feels comfortable talking like street Vietnamese, but she gets
mhm.
really scared to teach me. So it's just really interesting because I've seen like the effect. It's like it's a forceful effect of these colonizations, and it divides people. And so, yeah, the idea of, can there be a peaceful version of it? I mean, if someone's coming into your world and they're affecting your culture, can that even be peaceful?
Well, I think affecting cultures can be, certainly, but when we are using the phrase corporate colonialism, corporate by definition involves a ledger, profits and
Mm,
losses.
yes.
And so as soon as you attach monetary measurable profit and loss to the value of a place or a culture or a people, the equation is already broken.
Because people are just numbers now.
Right, exactly. And I think that in my book, at least, one of the things I explore is the company town, tied to that idea. So it does, we do see a lot of the negative effects of that rush to colonize and exploit the resources. That's a big theme in the book. But the people themselves are all participants in the smaller version of that, which is the company town, where the human resources that they provide are measured by profits and losses. And like you said before, they're offered that subsistence opportunity, but oh, you can do better, you can do more. And these towns are part of the calculations for a quarterly profit. So if we're looking at other examples in the real world, back to the mining towns.
Mhm.
So around Colorado, a couple come to mind, maybe Somerset and Ashcroft and Redstone. And these towns were all here on the western slope near where I live. And the mining companies would, to varying degrees, provide resources. They would provide homes. You would get credit at the company store. And they did it all along a scope. There's always the most exploitive, and then there's the best. So if you look at Redstone, it's an interesting example. One of the big railroad barons, the Vanderbilt era barons, came out and bought up this land up the Crystal River Valley, and they built pretty nice homes. They created this town where they hoped that their workers could actually stay. So there was room for families to grow. There was churches, schools, not just entertainment, and, as I think we'll talk about later, unhealthy coping mechanisms. So on the
Mhm.
one end, those those were people who were hoping that their employees would stay and perhaps saw more value in them. And then you have other ones like Somerset, which is this tiny town in Gunnison County that almost no one knows about. And it was just dumped by its quote corporate parent, I guess, within the last 10 to 15 years. They pulled out from coal mining and sort of left the town to its own devices. It doesn't have a government structure. Its water system is antiquated and keeps failing tests, and there's no one to prop it up. And all of the homes were eventually sold to the residents, I think sometime in the 60s, but the resources are just not available to make it a vibrant community. And they're reeling from that right now. If you can drive through it and just see this sort of ghost town where people are, people are resilient. I'm never going to downplay that. They've bounced back in surprising ways. But when you look at it on paper, in our state, in my lifetime, to have a corporation just suddenly view an entire town as a loss and just pull out and leave them to figure it out.
Tell me about unhealthy coping methods.
Oh, tell me, Vicki, as a question back to you, what is the most bored that you have ever been?
Oh gosh. Probably not as bored as living in a mining town, I'm guessing, if there's no work and you've been abandoned.
It's so many things, right? So your day-to-day work, first of all, if you're in one of these towns, if you're in a mining town, or my experience personally, I worked for Rocky Mountain Youth Corps, which is not exploitive at all. It involved some very repetitive manual labor, carrying rocks, moving buckets of rocks, digging in the dirt with tools for 9 hours a day, literally just moving rocks, nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're somebody who has an intellectual life and you're used to conversation and reading and interest, you have to discover this whole part of your brain that functions in boredom, that doesn't track every second passing. For me, I signed up for a 6-week stint doing that, and I barely made it through. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done at that age.
What did you have to do during that time?
So we were building trails.
Okay.
So we were a trail maintenance crew. Sorry for the context there. Up High Rockies. So we would hike up to our sites and we'd camp in our tents every night for about 6 weeks, working with a team of 10. So I had beautiful vistas and I had good food and I had the assurance that this was temporary. Without that assurance, and it's your life, you start to flirt with the hopelessness, and you never want hopelessness in your head. So you're always going to try and drive it away. What are you going to drive it away with? I mean, pick any of the classic vices, drinking, drugs, relationships that are, shall we say, not healthy, anything like that. There's so many different ways, but if you're truly bored and you're truly sure that you'll never get out of here, because somehow you just can't beat the company's ledger. You just can't have enough credits. They say you were going to this time, but then the cost of goods rose or the cost of travel rose, and it's all controlled by one company. It's that hopelessness that really takes you down, and you look for any escape from it.
In the event that your community is a future target of corporate colonialism, are you going to hear any particular rhetoric or messaging ahead of their arrival to get your buy-in or anything like that? Or do they just like show up, plant themselves down and take over?
For my community, because we have the privilege of being financially healthy, lots of people are native English speakers, it would have to look like some serious promises. I mean, it's this, I don't know how to say it. I don't think
like 500 more jobs are coming to this region.
Right.
And you go, yeah.
Didn't Google and Facebook just do that? Didn't they try to start their own company towns out there in the valleys in California? And they
wouldn't be surprised if they
promised housing and transportation and resources and stores and everything. And I don't have the details, so I don't want to get
actually, I talked about that in another episode, like corporatocracy, the idea of corporate towns, based off of the cell phone cities and stuff like that. Yeah, I did see that headline come out because Rob Hart shared it, and he's like, people have been reading his book. So yeah, it's kind of scary because they promise you this whole city, but then you become really dependent on them, and then once you become dependent on them, they start they start charging you, and you have no other options. They create their own banking system, all those things.
Well, and the other thing too is just to circle back to the very beginning, largely the system only becomes like that when you bring your corporate desires into a vulnerable population with resources. So those of us who have an educated population, who have government checks and balances are less likely to suffer from it, as opposed to an area that's unstable because of disease or war, or doesn't have financial resources or a stable government. So when we're looking at who's at risk, it's definitely not necessarily us. That being said, it's really interesting because strange relationships develop with a company when you depend on them for everything. So you'd think, you can hate them, but that even becomes part of your identity. It's very difficult to extract yourself and your direction in life from that corporate entity when it controls every aspect of your life. And that's something that my characters kind of flirt with as well. Like, they outwardly despise this company, but when it comes down to it, it's so ingrained in their fabric of who they are and what they see themselves becoming, that it's equally impactful as if you were just a company sycophant.
Is it kind of like when there's a Walmart in your town and they basically eliminate all, mom pa shops because they can't compete and you hate them for it, but they become the only resource you have. So you shop at Walmart even though you hate Walmart.
Right. And people are infinitely adaptable. And so honestly, they bring Walmart into their culture, into their day-to-day life, into who and where they're meeting and what they're doing. And then it becomes inextricable. You can't pull it out when it impacts you on so many levels. And the
Interesting.
other thing that companies do that's really interesting to the populations that they are maybe more the employees, the company town part, instead of the exploited populations, is when resources are scarce, there's an us versus them mentality, right? So perceived scarcity drives our psyche in a big way, and we're going to always try to defend what's ours against those that would take it. Instead of looking up, though, very often those divisions fall with the workers, between the workers. There's when there's a filter on all the information they're getting, there's room for conspiracies, there's room for tribalism, there's room for this, like, there's not enough to go around, so I have to fight for what's mine, which means that they are less likely to then turn against the actual source of the problem.
And you say perceived scarcity. Are there instances where the scarcity is manufactured?
Well, if you have a supply line that's controlled by one company that's only interested in their bottom line, there'll definitely be scarcity, because why would they send too much to somewhere and make sure that it's difficult to play with. I would imagine, I'm trying to think if there's any examples. I don't want to speculate too much.
Well, I always think about one, like, I don't know if it's true or not, but the headlines that hit, like, we're going to have a bacon shortage, we're going to have a chocolate shortage.
Yes,
And then we
yes.
all end up buying a ton of bacon and chocolate. And
It
then I
builds
don't
right
hear
now.
about shortages anymore.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely it, especially when there's only one person writing the headlines for these towns. So that's, I think, where science fiction allows us to take this another step, because nowadays we think of the connectivity that we have with cell phones and the internet, and so of course with speculative fiction, you've got to remove that from the equation. Somebody could just look something up and be like, oh, that's not fair, they're doing X, Y, and Z to us, let's move over here. That's why speculative fiction, I think, plays with these isolated communities so much, because then you get to really put a microscope on human nature when you don't feel secure, when you don't have another option.
Well, I do kind of see a lot of the controlled narrative online, because a lot of people have moved away from Google as a search engine. And I see it too. Like, I remember 5-6 years ago, if you had a problem with the platform, like Instagram just had an update and they're doing something funny with captions, you can Google that and you will find the most relevant information to it. And it would always be some obscure chat box and someone is trying to talk about, a workaround, and you go, yeah, that solved my problem. Awesome. Now, when I write that same kind of search, it only gives me Instagram's help pages. And it's really hard to find someone outside of Instagram. So you could tell that the SEOs are like on fire right now for these major corporations. So now people are moving to TikTok, which is interesting because I've noticed that they've really increased their search functions. But TikTok is also guilty of creating the tunnel effect, where you only see the things that reaffirm your thoughts and your inner circle. So it's also hard to get outside of that way of thinking. So I think back to the wild wild west of the internet decades ago, and we've definitely moved away from it.
Yeah, the filter bubbles that we've created around ourselves are unbelievable, almost incomprehensible, when you think that there's millions and millions of people on the same platform every day, and yet you only hear messaging from the same 30. Or you only see the same 6 corporations showing up in your sidebar ads. And so that tracks with everything that we're saying as far as controlling the narrative. By the way, just on a bit of a tangent, have you read the book Feed?
I have not.
It was a young adult novel that was written by somebody Anderson, and I read it back in the mid-aughts, early aughts.
Okay.
And of all of the dystopians, you look at your Brave New World, your 1984, what's it going to be? That book nailed it, 100% hands down.
As far as like controlled messaging or
Yeah, controlled messaging and the corporate aspect of people being only looked at as their ability to provide profit as predictable consumers.
Gotcha.
So that's a little bit on the tangent from where we are right now. But if you just want to read a book that is the most accurate version of how it'll all fall apart, I would point to that.
Okay. Feed. Okay. Good to know.
And
What
there's a
other
Netflix
examples
movie,
of,
not that one.
oh, so sorry. I'm sorry. I missed that.
I apologize. There was a Netflix movie that was called the same thing, and maybe it was based off it, but it's not the same.
Oh, okay. Any other real life corporate colonialism examples that you could think of?
So real life examples. Well, it's not really a real life example, but I did stumble across a company that it is real life, but a little off the topic of the question, a company that you can contract with to design your company town, even today.
What?
You can reach out to them and ask, because there's still a lot of mineral extraction going on in Africa, whether it's diamonds or whether it's other valuable resources like that. They're still building these kinds of towns. And there's people buying up farmland to be able to extract it. And so you can reach out to these guys and they'll help design a town that keeps people in one place, limits their information, gives them everything they need, and serves your company ledger.
This is a service that's available.
Yep. I'm not going to give you the name just because I don't know how well these people are connected. But if you look it up for designing company town or plat for a company town, you'll probably stumble across it.
Wow. That just makes me think of The Sims, the Sim City, where I'm following this guy. I think it's like, oh no, Jackery might be Jackery Don't, I think is his TikTok handle, where he creates the most ridiculous city. Like he made a spiral city where you have to complete an entire one-way spiral to enter and exit a community, and like all the craziness that comes out of it. But I imagine software like that be very effective when planning your corporate colony.
Yeah,
Interesting.
very much a modern discussion.
What is we talked about this, but I guess this is where my question is more explicit, but what is the root of corporate colonialism when we get down to the nitty-gritty of human behavior and groupthink? And I thought this question would help for things like character developments and establishing systems of oppression.
It comes back a little bit to the idea that if you can, you should, and that if it makes a profit, you definitely should. And I think that's not pervasive across the world by any means. It's a very Western ideal. But if you're like me and you're writing from that perspective, that is a driving factor. And so there's no actual malice towards the people that you're exploiting. Maybe there's even some guilt when you see the systems that you've disrupted, but in your mind, there is a higher value. There is a higher power of quarterly growth.
Gotcha. So creating characters, we talk so much about, don't make your villain two-dimensional. I mean, there's some merit in a two-dimensional villain, but by having a three-dimensional villain, they're not going to be this taking over these little, communities just for the sake of it being evil. It's like they have this, well, first of all, internal bias probably for the community itself, and this focus on finances and maybe even this accountability towards other people, right, that are relying on them to make money, the stockholders or whoever. So there's a lot of like, it makes them more relatable. They're still awful. Like there's stress associated with that role.
Absolutely. My villain goes a bit of a different direction. She came from a very unsecure background where she never had enough resources, never enough food, lived through a worldwide famine and had to do all kinds of terrible things to survive. And so her entire goal, every single move she's ever made, has just been to shore up her power so that she never feels vulnerable again.
Wow. At the cost of others.
At the cost of anything. Yeah, I mean, she can't, whatever wall she's built for herself never will allow insecurity into her life again, and she'll keep moving up and up and up to the point where she's basically, spoilers, whatever, selling an entire planet to secure her position.
Isn't that interesting how you can come out of trauma like many ways, but you could either, in an attempt to secure your own safety, push that same exact trauma onto other people, or you can grow from the trauma and not to create those circumstances again. It's really interesting. It's very human to go whatever way, you're triggered to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I struggle with that in my book. My main character has the same inklings and has to make different choices, which are also very difficult for her to not end up that way. But there's a lot of similarities between her and the villain.
Interesting. So in the circumstance of corporate colonialism, is it one villain or is it many?
I think different points in history would answer that differently. There are certainly examples where charismatic individuals or very driven humans who had the ability to sway others and the ability to make choices that impacted millions stepped into that role. And then I also feel like there's opportunities for the faceless bureaucracy to steamroll through otherwise vulnerable situations.
So what can be done by is this community completely helpless because of their conditions? They were targeted, because they're helpless. Are they able to get help somehow? What is the solution for things like this?
Well, it brings back down to another just omnipresent theme in science fiction, and that's the idea of the other, right? Your characters who are viewed as other than the dominant culture. And I think that you can't talk about corporate colonialism without looking at it from that perspective. And so it's super important for those communities to not internalize the otherness, to protect their culture and their values. And for those of us who don't understand them, to get out of the way so that they can take that power back. Because as long as they're seen only as a value of their resources, they're not even in the conversation. And as long as we can make room for more of those voices to join the conversation, to explain to us everything that we don't understand.
Yes.
That's all I could see making a difference.
There was that pipeline project that was going to cross native lands, and there was a lot of noise against it. And I believe it still happened. And then there was an oil spill recently. Have you been following that project?
I have. Yes.
Is that an example of what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. A really heartbreaking example. Because other voices don't have the weight and the microphone and the platform. And so they make the headlines for as long as the headlines are getting clicked on.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we're tired of hearing about it, that's the only platform and it gets taken away.
You and I both having a media relations background, can these community members deploy effective PR that will help elevate their voice? And by that I mean, like, it even has to be very clickbaity, right? Like, can they deploy those same tools, or do you think that there are barriers in the way?
Well, I'll point to one positive example. And again, I don't mean to take ownership for this by explaining it to you, and I'm very much on the outside of it. But the tribes in the Colorado River Basin, as we are dealing with a water storage crisis across a basin that affects 40 million people, they have traditionally, while they have owned water on paper, have never been given the resources to actually develop that water. So for example, tribal lands that cross the Colorado River, not having the money, which is millions and millions, to build infrastructure, to take the water out, to treat it, to make it potable. And as we're looking at diminishing resources, they have actually been invited, fortunately, and have made their voices heard at the table. There's several very outspoken individuals who do testimonies at Senate Agriculture Committee hearings, and there is hope that their calls on the river will be honored, even as we look at potentially reallocating some of those resources. So, but the amount of work that they have had to do to have a door cracked open for them, individuals who put themselves through law school to be able to advocate for their communities, even though no one in their lives had ever mentored that path for them. And then suddenly, because they can show up and sound like we expect someone to sound, or look like we expect someone to look at a committee hearing, they're getting listened to. I don't honestly know if that's solving the problem, but in the future, like what we're looking at with the Colorado River right now, it gives me some hope. So when we speak with tribes about these water resources, as a culture that wasn't raised as a native culture, I am looking at it in measurement quantities. How much water, how much money, how much irrigation, how many acres of land. And when they consider the future choices that we're going to have to make, and you speak to someone like Amelia Flores, who speaks for the 10 tribes in the Colorado River Basin, and she talks about, well, we are meant to take care of the river as well. And you're like, what, really? And that just hasn't even been in the conversation yet. And so they have had to leave their premise of cultural understanding. I can't get into this because I feel like I'm appropriating it too much, but it's amazing the patience and persistence that has been shown for them to be able to have come as far in the conversation as they have.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation, especially because corporate colonialism is a big part of speculative fiction. We've covered a couple of examples, but just the idea of this fight between a community and people against something that feels so powerful, and the I don't know if the fight, the good and evil, as it's portrayed in fiction. So do you have any like final comments or ideas about corporate colonialism that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I think that because we see so much of it in our modern world, it's a very relevant topic. And if you decide to place characters within that system, you're going to see a lot of reflection on day-to-day life, which I think creates great tension and propelling people forward. They get to do some of the things that we wish we could do. In my book, it comes down to accepting the other, and that not all, quote, problems or changes or differences need to be fixed, and that in that way they are successful in the long run. And there's a lot of richness in character development when you're in that sort of small town, that company town. There's the unhealthy coping mechanisms. There's the very tribalistic nature of us versus them, bit of small town hysteria, maybe a mob or two, I don't know. But when you have characters who are under that sort of pressure and who are unable to escape it, everything's controlled from the outside, you are going to see them just change and grow and be very interesting people who probably swear quite a bit.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed having this. So where can people find you?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at LMDeFrates, and then I have a website, LindsayDeFrates.com, and I have a fledgling TikTok, Lindsay.Writes.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.